A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn, and I am sitting here in our living room in Jerusalem with my brother. It is a bit of a heavy atmosphere outside today, and honestly, the same goes for inside the house.
Herman Poppleberry here. Yeah, Corn, the sirens, and the general state of the city lately, it definitely changes the vibe. Usually, our housemate Daniel sends us an audio prompt to kick things off. But today the whole team, Daniel included, decided we needed to step back and look at the big picture of what is happening around us. We are in the middle of this massive conflict involving Israel, the United States, and Iran, and we keep hearing this phrase over and over on the news, state of emergency.
It is one of those terms that sounds scary and official, but I realized this morning that I do not fully understand the legal gears that turn when a government actually signs that piece of paper. We have talked about the military side of things, like back in episode 623 when we looked at what happens during a maximum alert, but the legal state of emergency is a different beast. It is about power, right? It is about what the government is suddenly allowed to do, that they were not allowed to do yesterday.
That is exactly right. At its core, a state of emergency is a legal declaration that allows a government to perform actions or implement policies that it would normally be restrained from doing. It is a recognition that the normal, slow, deliberative process of law and democracy is too sluggish to handle a sudden threat, whether that is a war, a natural disaster, or a pandemic. Think of it like a biological response. When your body is under attack, your heart rate spikes and your adrenaline flows. A state of emergency is like a shot of legal adrenaline for the state.
But adrenaline can be dangerous if it stays in the system too long. I want to dig into the mechanics of this. If we look at the United States first, because they are so heavily involved in the current regional conflict, what does the framework actually look like? Most people think the president just has a big red emergency button, but I assume it is more structured than that.
It is, though maybe less structured than some would like. In the United States, the primary framework is the National Emergencies Act of 1976. Before that act, presidents could just declare emergencies and they would stay on the books forever. Seriously, some were active for decades. The 1976 law was supposed to rein that in. It requires the president to specify which existing legal powers he is invoking. See, there are nearly 500 different statutory powers scattered throughout the United States Code that only wake up when an emergency is declared.
So it is not that the declaration itself creates new laws. It is more like it unlocks a hidden menu of options that Congress already pre-approved for a rainy day.
Precisely. For example, it might unlock the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, which lets the president freeze assets and block financial transactions with foreign entities, something we are seeing used heavily against Iranian-linked groups right now. It can also unlock Section 706 of the Communications Act, which theoretically gives the president the power to shut down or take control of wire communications. But here is the catch, Corn. While the act was meant to limit power, it actually created a situation where the United States is almost always in a state of emergency. As of today, March 4, 2026, there are over 40 active national emergencies in the United States. Some date back to the Iranian hostage crisis in 1979.
That is wild. It makes you wonder if the word emergency even means anything if it lasts for nearly 50 years. But looking at our situation here in Israel, the framework is a bit different, right? We have been in a technical state of emergency since 1948.
We have. It is a unique legal quirk of the State of Israel. Under the Law and Administration Ordinance, the Provisional State Council declared a state of emergency in May of 1948, and the Knesset has renewed it every year since. It allows the government to issue emergency regulations that can literally override existing laws. Now, in the context of the current war with Iran and the regional escalation we have seen over the last few months, the government has invoked specific special situations on the home front. That is what gives the home front command the authority to tell us to stay near bomb shelters, to close schools, or even to restrict the movement of people in certain zones.
I think this is where the friction starts for a lot of people. We understand the need for safety, especially when there are missiles in the air, but there is always that concern about civil liberties. When the government gets the power to, say, track cell phone data, or limit where people can gather, how do we ensure those powers actually go away when the missiles stop flying?
That is the million-dollar question, and it is why the legal framework matters so much. In a healthy system, there has to be a sunset clause. In the United States, the National Emergencies Act technically requires Congress to meet every 6 months to consider a vote on whether the emergency should end. In practice, they rarely do it, but the real check is the court system. Even in an emergency, the government usually has to prove that its actions are proportional to the threat.
You mentioned proportionality, but during a war like the one we are seeing now, the threat is existential. If you look at historical examples, the definition of proportional gets stretched pretty thin. I was reading about how Abraham Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus during the American Civil War. That is a massive deal. Telling someone they can be arrested and held without seeing a judge just because there is a war on.
Lincoln is the classic case study for this. He argued that it was better to break one law than to let the entire Union fall apart and all the laws be destroyed. He famously asked, "Are all the laws but one to go unexecuted, and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated?" It is a powerful argument, but it sets a precedent that can be abused. If the executive branch gets to decide when the survival of the nation is at stake, they can justify almost anything.
And we have seen that elsewhere. Think about the Roman Republic. They actually had an official office called the dictator. It was not a dirty word back then, it was a legal position. When the city was in extreme danger, the Senate would appoint a dictator for 6 months with absolute power to lead the army and make laws. The idea was that one man could move faster than a committee of 300.
Cincinnatus is the hero of that story. He was a farmer who was given absolute power, defeated the enemy in 15 days, and then immediately resigned and went back to his plow. He is the ideal. The problem is when you get a Julius Caesar who decides that the emergency never actually ends. Or worse, look at the 1933 Reichstag fire decree in Germany. That was a state of emergency declaration that suspended most civil liberties, and it was never repealed. It became the legal basis for the entire Nazi regime. This is something we touched on in episode 691 regarding the long alert. When a conflict becomes a permanent feature of life, the emergency powers become the new normal.
That is what worries me about the current geopolitical landscape. Between the cyber attacks, the drone strikes, and the naval blockades in the Red Sea, the lines between war and peace are getting very blurry. If we are always in a gray zone of conflict, do we just accept that the government always has emergency powers? For instance, look at how the United States used the Defense Production Act recently. That is a relic of the Korean War that allows the president to force private companies to prioritize government contracts.
It is a perfect example of a power that was born in a hot war and is now used for everything from medical supplies to green energy initiatives. From a conservative perspective, that is exactly where the abuse happens. When you take a power meant for a national survival situation and use it to bypass the regular legislative process for policy goals, you are eroding the separation of powers.
Let us talk about the practical impact on the ground for a second. If a state of emergency is declared tomorrow in a major American city because of the spillover from this conflict, what does the average person actually see? Is it just more police on the street? Or is it deeper?
It is usually deeper. First, you have resource allocation. The government can suddenly seize private property if they need it for the war effort or for emergency housing. They can implement curfews, which we have seen in various contexts lately. They can also control the flow of information. Under certain emergency statutes in the United States and elsewhere, the government has the authority to shut down or take over communication networks if they deem it necessary for national security. Imagine a world where the internet is suddenly restricted to essential services only.
That sounds like a nightmare for the modern economy. But I suppose the counter-argument is that if the electrical grid is being hammered by Iranian cyber units, the government needs the power to prioritize power for hospitals and military bases over, say, people streaming movies.
It is a trade-off between efficiency and liberty. In a state of emergency, you are betting that the government will be a good steward of that temporary power. But history shows us that power is rarely returned voluntarily. Look at the United Kingdom during World War II. They passed the Emergency Powers Defense Act in 1939. It gave the government the power to do basically anything except conscript people for the army or labor, and then they even added those powers later. They were regulating everything from the price of bread to how much light could show through your windows at night.
And the British people largely accepted it because the threat was literally at their doorstep. I think that is the key. The public will tolerate a lot if the threat is visible and immediate. But what happens when the threat is invisible? Like a cyber war or a long-term intelligence struggle. We saw this after September 11th with the Patriot Act in the United States. That was an emergency response that fundamentally changed how surveillance works in the West, and most of those powers are still active 25 years later.
That is the creep we have to be vigilant about. As we discuss these topics on My Weird Prompts, we always try to look at the second-order effects. The second-order effect of a state of emergency is the permanent expansion of the administrative state. Once a government agency gets a new power or a new budget line during a crisis, they will fight tooth and nail to keep it. They will find a new emergency to justify it.
So, how do we fix the framework? If you were designing a state of emergency law from scratch, Herman, how would you balance it? You are the one who is always reading these policy papers. There has to be a better way than just trust the government.
I think it comes down to three things: transparency, narrowness, and automatic expiration. First, the government should have to list exactly which powers it is using and why in a way that the public can see. No secret memos. Second, the powers should be narrow. If the emergency is a naval blockade, you do not need the power to regulate domestic farm prices. And third, the most important one, is the hard sunset. The emergency should expire every 30 days unless the legislature explicitly votes to renew it. Not a passive renewal where it stays active if they do nothing, but an active renewal where they have to go on the record and say, yes, the threat is still there.
That sounds like it would force a lot more accountability. But in the current climate, with the way politics is so polarized, could you even get a legislature to agree on that? Half the time, they cannot even pass a basic budget. If you require an active vote every 30 days, you might end up with the emergency powers lapsing right when a fleet of drones is crossing the border, because some politicians wanted to score points.
That is the risk. Efficiency is the enemy of liberty, but in a war, efficiency is what keeps you alive. It is a brutal paradox. Here in Israel, we see it every day. The government has a lot of power because we live in a neighborhood where threats move fast. But even here, there is a constant debate in the Knesset and the Supreme Court about where the line is. For example, during some of the recent escalations, there were big debates about whether the government could use phone tracking technology that was designed for counterterrorism to track civilians for other purposes.
I remember that. It was a huge controversy. People were saying, look, we know you have this tech to catch terrorists, but if you start using it on us, even for our own safety, you have crossed a bridge you can never go back across.
And that brings us back to the role of the citizen. In a state of emergency, the citizen's job is to stay informed and stay skeptical. You can support the war effort, you can support the defense of your country, and you can still ask, why is this specific regulation necessary? Why does the government need to control this specific sector of the economy right now?
It is about maintaining that distinction between the nation and the government. You can love the nation and be wary of the government's use of emergency powers. I think about the situation with the United States military buildup we discussed in episode 831. As more troops and assets move into the region, the legal framework for their operation becomes more complex. Are they operating under standard rules of engagement? Or has a specific emergency declaration changed the legal landscape for how they interact with local governments?
It usually has. When the United States deploys troops under an emergency declaration, it often triggers things like the War Powers Resolution, which is another whole layer of legal complexity. The president has 60 days to get congressional approval after sending troops into hostilities. But again, presidents of both parties have found ways to wiggle around that for decades by calling things limited engagements or support missions.
It feels like the legal language is always trying to catch up to the reality of the weapons. A hypersonic missile moves faster than a legal brief can be written. But we have to have the briefs, otherwise we are just living under the rule of whoever has the biggest gun.
The rule of law is what separates a civilized defense from a simple military junta. Even in the heat of the current conflict, the fact that we are even having this discussion, the fact that people are arguing about the legality of emergency measures in the United States or the Knesset is a sign of a functioning society. The moment people stop asking, is this legal, and just start asking, is this effective? That is when the state of emergency has won.
That is a sobering thought. Let us pivot a bit to the practical takeaways for our listeners. If you are living in a country that formally declares a state of emergency, what should you actually do? Beyond the obvious safety stuff, how do you navigate the legal and social changes?
The first thing is to actually read the declaration if you can. Most people just read the headline, but the devil is in the details. What specific powers were invoked? Is there a curfew? Are there new restrictions on financial transactions? We have seen emergency measures in some countries that include freezing the bank accounts of protesters or political opponents. You need to know if your basic rights to your own property have been altered.
And I would add, keep a record of how these powers are being used. If you see an abuse of power, document it. Emergencies are often used as a cover for things that have nothing to do with the actual crisis. If a local official is using emergency authority to shut down a business they do not like, that needs to be brought to light.
Also, be prepared for the economic shift. States of emergency often lead to market volatility. We have seen the shekel and the dollar react wildly to the news lately. Governments might also implement price controls or rationing. Having a bit of a buffer, whether that is physical supplies or a diversified portfolio, is just common sense when the legal framework of the economy is subject to change at the stroke of a pen.
We talked about survival strategies for sustained conflict in episode 691, and a big part of that is mental preparation. Knowing that the rules of the game can change overnight helps you stay calm when it happens. If you know that a state of emergency is a legal tool with a history and a framework, it is less of a shock than if you think the world is just ending.
That is the goal of this episode, really, to demystify the term. It is a powerful tool, it is often a necessary tool, but it is a tool that requires a lot of supervision. We are seeing it play out in real time right now with the United States and Israel facing off against the Iranian axis. The decisions made under these emergency powers in the next few months will probably shape the geopolitics of the 2030s.
It is a lot to process. I am looking out the window now at the Jerusalem skyline, and it is strange to think about all these invisible legal structures hovering over the city, just as real as the drones or the Iron Dome interceptors. One protects the physical space, and the other is supposed to protect the social and legal space, though sometimes it feels like they are at odds.
They often are. Corn. That is the tension of the human condition in a fallen world. We want safety, but we want freedom, and in an emergency, you often have to trade a bit of one for the other. The key is making sure you get a fair deal, and that you get your freedom back when the danger passes.
Well, I think we have covered the ground on what these declarations actually mean. It is a mix of ancient Roman tradition, Cold War statutes, and modern high-tech surveillance. It is a lot more complex than just a state of emergency headline.
It definitely is. And for those of you listening who are navigating these same tensions, whether you are here in the Middle East or watching from the States or Europe, stay vigilant. Understand the laws of your own country. If you want to dive deeper into some of the specific military alerts we have mentioned, check out episode 623 on our website.
Yeah, and if you are interested in how the current situation with Iran is developing from a ground-level perspective, episode 801 has a great breakdown of the situational reports we were seeing last month. You can find all of that at myweirdprompts.com. We have the full archive there, and it is searchable if you are looking for specific topics.
And hey, before we wrap up, we have been doing this for over 900 episodes now, and the only way new people find the show is through your support. If you have a minute and you are listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, leave us a review. It sounds like a small thing, but it actually helps the algorithm show the podcast to other people who might be interested in these deep dives.
It really does help. We appreciate all of you who have stuck with us through all the weird prompts and the heavy topics like today. It is a weird world out there, and we are just trying to make sense of it together.
Well said, brother. I think that is a good place to leave it. We picked this topic because it felt urgent, and I hope it gave everyone some clarity on what is happening behind the scenes of those news alerts.
Definitely. Thanks to the whole team for pushing us to talk about this one today. It was needed.
Alright, this has been My Weird Prompts. We will be back soon with another deep dive into whatever the world or Daniel throws at us next.
Stay safe out there, everyone. We will talk to you in the next one.
Until next time, goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts.